don't care what mood I'm in. Are you talking about Tyler?
Yeah, did you see Tyler? Tyler was crushing it, man. Oh
Yeah.
man.
For those
You
who
say well, you don't care what, but you heard that
I don't
music
care what
picked
mood
you
I'm
up?
in. Like right pre-show, I can be like, man, I don't know if I'm feeling it today. And then that music hits, and I'm like, let's fucking go.
Yeah, shout out to Taylor Galford who helped us with that beat. But yeah, it picks me up every time too. And yeah, so this is a Wednesday afternoon. Usually we're on Fridays, but we're gonna start Wednesday this week. So as per usual, Corey and I looked at each other and like, do you have anything to talk about? No. Do you? No. Well, maybe let's just start talking then. So for those of you just tuning in, this is not investment advice. This is just two dudes in pirate sweaters. One just happens to be a better, darker color than the other one. That's better, shows up better on camera, especially when you're sitting against a white wall in the background. But
white
we're
wall
just
with sun streaming behind you. I'm doing
you.
everything that you could possibly do to ruin video. I've gone all at full steam ahead.
I figure, yeah, one of these days we're gonna catch me in like just an epic rant, like, "Come on, Corey, get your shit together." And that's going to be the outtake for the pod. But I was going into our disclaimer. It's like, obviously nothing but we talk about is investment advice. Please do your own due diligence. Hire investment professional. Don't listen to these two idiots that are live on YouTube on a Wednesday afternoon in pirate sweaters. I didn't realize too that these are technically kind of like Halloween-ish, because I was wearing mine last night.
Right.
And somebody's like, "Oh, Halloween." And I was like, "What?" I didn't realize Halloween's around the corner. I'm terrible at holidays. But once again, I'm pro pirate sweater team. I think you're upset now that I went with the Navy.
Well, I'm upset last week you showed up without it, and then this week you one-upped me. That's what I'm upset about. I'm upset that I bought you a sweater that you've decided to replace with a better sweater.
Well, good thing they're recycled from oyster shells, so we're not. Shout out to Seawell and Long Wharf Supply if anybody wants to pick up their own pirate sweater. Corey has reached out to him for the collab, but they're apparently not interested in shows that have 7 viewers. So, I think maybe we should just stick the world famous booty crew on them and start, pounding, Long Wharf Supply until they start doing our own line of sweaters. So maybe that's the way we tackle it. We get the 7 of us, the Bay Hive of the booty crew, to really just put all their efforts at them. So I wanted to start with, I was trying not to talk about this because you brought it up when you're on there. I'm traveling, I'm in Philly, you are in Denver area, but then you started to say you're in Breckenridge, but you're at it looks like a really well-decorated Airbnb that's not a stark modernist cube, or?
Well, this is the most Colorado Airbnb house I've ever rented. Full transparency, I've got a team offsite going on right now. I'm traveling this week. We have this big house rented that the whole team is here, hanging out, planning for next year, going over stuff that's always easier in person when you're a remote company. And this house that we rented is 15, 20 minutes from downtown Breckenridge. It's a cool house, but it is there are 0 furnishings. It is the most perfect Airbnb house you can imagine. They did not the bare minimum, but it's exactly what you would expect a modern mountain home to look like. It's got the right amount of wood and stone. All the walls are white. You've got sort of the blend of dark and light, and then there's 0 functionality. It's beds. And I was like, okay, where are the desks so I can do this? There's no desks anywhere. I have pulled a side table in front of me sitting in a chair. You go down to the living space, there's a couch. There's nothing else around it. There's just this massive open space. And I was like, it's interesting to think about this. Clearly someone doesn't live here. There's no plants. There's it is just pure functional. And I looked up how much it sold for, and it sold last year for 1.8 million. And I was like, I don't understand the ROI on this, because we're not, if you were to take our weekly rate and multiply it by 52 weeks, the number doesn't make sense. I'm realizing.
Is that my internet or is yours?
No, that's mine. That's mine. I'm in the mountains, man.
Even better. So I asked you to kind of pause on this so we could actually talk about this, because I think there's so many business things around this. And so do you know if you rented it from a company like Sonder or any of those, or it seems like individual thus far?
They have individuals who are front facing, right? It's Joe and whoever, Joe and Susan, right,
Yeah.
are in theory who we're renting from. But for all I know, that's just a front for a company, right?
Yeah, so a couple of things I was thinking about on that front is like I've been looking at Airbnbs here in like Philly area, especially like downtown Philly. And when you start looking at most metropolitan areas these days, there's companies like Sonder, Front Desk. I'm forgetting the names of some of the others, but they're kind of like they're dominating kind of this space. But what's interesting to me, like you're saying, is like when you have these companies that are really looking to maximize their ROI, they're putting like the shittiest furniture in there, the least amount of furniture, right? And then they're just trying to like turn and burn. Where if you get an actual individual that's renting it out, they probably over decorate, right? And they probably use furniture that actually gets, beat up and gets wear and tear faster than you would if you were actually running it like a proper business. And so it's been interesting to me to see that dichotomy when you're going to metropolitan areas, looking at the difference between things that are obviously part of an aggregate exposure to the Airbnb space versus people individually renting. And part of that is like my brother used to try to do a lot of this stuff we used to talk about all the time is like you have all these entrepreneurs that started just Airbnb properties, right? And you had a huge kind of flush out during COVID, right? When nobody could obviously travel or Airbnb. But even prior to COVID, what was interesting, you started getting these loan packages for Airbnbs that were insane. So like if you could basically roll up acquisition or put together a package of 10 Airbnbs, you could go to like a BlackRock, Blackstone, one of their subsidiaries and get like crazy loan packages based on the income of Airbnb. And you could qualify off the income, not necessarily the property values or even your own personal credit score. And then, when these things start to happen, and then a COVID type situation happens, people get kind of caught with their hands down. So that's part of it. The second part of it is like you also had people that were like just showing astronomical return on investments from Airbnbs, right? Like taking a normal house, turning it into Airbnb, as long as they had the permitting and approval. A lot of times people got screwed on permitting approval even after they were up and running, but they had these astronomical returns. And then I don't know if you've seen kind of what's going around lately is like people are saying their bookings on Airbnb are down like 50%.
Yeah.
It's like they're just getting absolutely crushed. And so how much is that recession? I think part of it's recession, but then part of it is like people think there's an issue like on Airbnb or now that almost like Uber and everything, now that the fees are raising, previously they were essentially subsidized, but now that the fees are going up and people are like, wait, why am I spending so much for an Airbnb when this luxury hotel down the street is now less expensive? And then I'm getting worse service and higher fees at Airbnb. And so that the trade-off of the balance seems to be tipping back into the favor of hotels. I'm curious if you have a take on that.
Yeah, I mean the sort of joke now is like you pay a cleaning service to come do at the Airbnb, but you have to clean the house first. Like when I came to this house, like there's a whole well done book about maintaining the house, and it's like there's 4 pages of checkout procedure at the end, and I'm like, why? Like I could just go to a hotel and you know what I do? I just walk out of the room. I don't even go check out at the desk. You just leave. Right. And they take care of it. And if you made an extraordinary mess, they'll bill you, which I don't. But if you're clean, like what? Like if someone's coming in to do the cleaning, why do I have to put all the towels in the washing machine? Like, isn't that part of the service? And if I'm gonna do all that, shouldn't it be cheaper? To your point, though, about like I was thinking about, is this an Airbnb house? A couple of things that make me think it is. It's got zero functionality as a true living space. Like there's nowhere to even store clothing, really. Like there's no dressers or anything like that, which makes me think it's pure temporary living. But counter to that, like they have a lot of rugs in this space. Okay, rugs might be cheaper than hardwood, but there's going to get a lot more wear and tear and risk of stains. I was looking at like the towels and stuff. If I were running an Airbnb house, I wouldn't have white towels. Like these are like pure white towels, which to me are more likely to get stained than a darker color. So there's some interesting choices of functionality versus beauty. If I was going for pure ROI here, like I think the furniture here is fine. I think this is probably, I think the price that it was bought at, I have a hard time seeing getting a reasonable ROI. But I also look around and I go, there's going to be more maintenance costs here potentially. Like it's not how I would explicitly design an Airbnb house. So my thought was, well, maybe this wasn't explicitly bought as an Airbnb house. It was bought as an investment property that they're Airbnb-ing with the intention of eventually selling to someone who wants to live here full time. It's hard to tell. I don't know this area at all. What I do know is mountain towns in Colorado went bananas in 2020 and 2021 from a property valuation perspective. So that 1.8 million that this place sold for may be dramatically overvalued.
Yeah, I was thinking about you're saying why do I have to put away the sheets or the dishes? It's like once we always talk about this is a show about nothing, and like we would try to say like Seinfeld, except for Seinfeld was entertaining and comedic. This is a show about nothing without entertainment, but it's almost like it's the same thing as like why do you wash the dishes before you put it in the dishwasher, or do you clean the house before the cleaning lady comes? It's the same thing with Airbnb. Like why am I doing this? Like
Yeah.
that's the kind of the nonsense around that. I was trying to look it up because I wanted to give a shout out to the author. But there was a great essay a few years ago called like the Airbnb-ification of the world, that basically the design space in Airbnb has just basically taken over the globe. And so it's basically, and as you know, it's almost like the Californication of the world is like the certain design space that we have, like that looks good on an Airbnb photo is now going to be your Airbnb in any country in the world. And, unfortunately, I was kind of lamenting this on when I was traveling in Europe and you and I were texting each other, is like every place is starting to look the same. I mean, boo-hoo, poor you that's traveling around, Europe, that every place is looking the same. But it's interesting. It's like, no matter where you go, there's a 70-inch screen TV playing, the English Premier League soccer. It has avocado toast and acai bowls and matcha latte, iced matcha lattes in like every cafe in the world now. But it's interesting how much just in our lifetimes, how much travel's changed due to like the internet, Airbnb, Instagram, and how design spaces there's no genus loci to anything anymore. It's kind of like homogenized across the world.
Well, in many ways, it's the McDonaldification. That one's hard to say.
Yeah.
McDonaldification of the world, right? This idea that you used to have local culinary, specialized culture, and the benefit of a McDonald's is that you can go to any McDonald's in the world and you know precisely what you're getting. And look, I've traveled through different parts of the world, and there have just been those days that I've gone, I kind of just want the McDonald's burger because I know what I'm going to get. I'm not risking anything, right? And so there's a certain amount of comfort to that, but it also destroys local culture, right? And it destroys, to your point, like if this is what the ideal American, travel person wants a house to look like, and you take away all the local charm and replace it with what our view of what that should look like, it does destroy a lot of local culture for our preferences of homogeneity wherever we go.
But at the same time, I'll take the other side of that. It was interesting, like you're saying, the McDonald's, version is like what always interests me is like what's hot in other countries that's like normal to us. So like KFC is huge in Japan, right? And then when I was just in Portugal, Burger King was like the shit. Those were like all the new restaurants. It wasn't about McDonald's. Like Burger King was like the coolness, right? But then at the same time, when I lived in Mexico back in the day, I was in San Miguel de Allende, which is a very like historical town. And there's a lot of like Americans and Europeans that live there, a lot of expats. And they were protesting Starbucks coming into the town. They didn't want Starbucks to come in. What was interesting then, Starbucks bought a very historic property, did a painstaking retrofit and restoration of that historic property, did a beautiful job. And the day that Starbucks opened, the Mexican locals were lined around the block to come in there because now all of a sudden it was an aspirational quality. You would take dates to Starbucks. So even though there was like, 5-10 times the price you pay for coffee down the street at like a local shop, it became a much more aspirational quality. And that one's always like seared into my brain is like, who are we to tell people that they shouldn't want the things that we want? Right. We want them like, no, dress in your historical garb and do a dance for me. That's insane. Like, so it's like at the same time, we're lamenting that everything's starting to look the same. But you can understand as the rest of the world has similar aspirational qualities to the Kardashians of why that happens. And who are we to say what's right and wrong in that sense?
The other interesting side of Airbnb, and you brought this up a little bit with being able to roll up and package properties. I got sort of two directions to take this. The first is the reliance on Airbnb as a platform, right? So it creates more value for Airbnb, but one of my very good friends happens to be one of the, if not the largest owner of the largest property management company in Atlanta. He's got 100+ houses that he oversees, and Airbnb was a huge part of his inbound funnel. And there was one day they miscoded something, and he lost like literally 6 months of forward rents. That people who had signed up just got a note basically saying, this host has been deplatformed from Airbnb. It was a complete mistake, but he lost all the bookings. And for him, he realized Airbnb is now a significant threat to my business, and I need to do everything I can to avoid being part of Airbnb. Interesting, it's interesting. Airbnb enables, and then Airbnb becomes the threat when it's too much of your business. The second point I want to make, because this will take us back to the world of finance a little bit, is this idea of packaging premium, which I think we may have touched on before, but this idea that large institutions and endowments, it's not really in their best interest to go down to the very bottom level and pick individual properties. They've got too much money to put at work. It's too operationally burdensome. So there are entire businesses dedicated to rolling up these properties into a packaged bundle that can then be sold at a premium to institutions who will bid on it, because it's now at capacity for it to actually move the needle. And it's a really interesting business model, in my opinion, where you're not renovating, you're not doing anything. The service you are providing is the roll-up. That, right, you can put together a block of 20 residential properties that are renting on Airbnb, and someone like a Harvard needs to buy a block of 20 at a time. To them, to buy one at a time actually is a negative ROI for doing all the research. If you do all that work for them, you can charge them a premium over what the individual value is for that packaging premium. And it's an entire line of business. And I think it's a very fascinating one, because it has nothing to do with renovation or, reusing the property in a more efficient way. The edge is in knowing your buyer.
Man, you nailed that one. Like we talked about in a way in our last episode with the Fortune 500 CPG companies. They don't spend money on R&D anymore. They look for the small startups that have found a niche audience, that have produced product market fit, and then they just buy them right at higher multiples, because then they can plug and play, and it's actually essentially for them buying at a lower multiple due to cost of capital. But that's exactly what happens in real estate. Like you said, if people don't have the granularity to come downstream, if you can roll that up, you need to know who your buyer is. Like I was explaining, forgive me, I don't think I've ever talked about this before, hopefully on the show, but like I remember a while back in Miami, I was explaining to some of the family offices that maybe didn't know the real estate game as well. And I was like, with commercial real estate, you have to always think about your end buyer. So for example, if I'm doing a value add flip, right, and I'm buying a 100-unit building, and I know I have to renovate a lot of those units and then release them at higher market rents, and that's going to be the value add, and then I can flip that property. Well, what I want to do is actually want to renovate 90 of the units, not 100. Because if next buyer is looking for a value add buyer, they need 10% of those units to be able to justify their value add to that purchase. Or like you said, if your end buyer is BlackRock or Blackstone or KKR or whoever you're selling to, and their minimum allocation size is 150 million or 1.5 billion, and they're looking for core CRE in tertiary cities, you can then target exactly your roll up to fit that parameters. Now, granted, it's going to take you a few years to aggregate all of that, and you better hope that's still what they're looking for. But like that's the way to do it. And what happened actually was interesting in the PE world is I had a lot of friends that were just buying up all these Amazon FBA businesses for cheap, packaging those up, and then they'd sell them for a much higher multiple, because of PE didn't want to come all the way downstream to that level. And so once again, it's like if you go to an individual seller that wants to sell their business for 500,000, you might be able to buy it at least a few years ago at like a 2 to 3x multiple. You package a bunch of those up, and you could sell them at a 5 to 6x multiple to a PE firm that didn't want to take the time to do so. And so, like you're saying, there's arbitrage there, but once again, I always take umbrage with this word arbitrage, because a real arbitrage, right, is I can buy and sell at the same time and make a spread. And that almost never happens anymore. So what we're really talking about is a time and sweat equity arbitrage.
Right.
And so it's a multiple arbitrage, but you're going to spend a lot of time working on it, and you better hope the buyer's there and the economy is good when you go to sell it or flip it.
Yeah. And when I think about our industry, right, are there examples within the world of public equities, public securities, like managing funds, right? And what you typically see there is the roll up is for economies of scale. There's fixed costs that come with running an asset management firm in the world of regulation and compliance. And when you merge two firms, often you can cut out a lot of the replicated costs. And so you unlock revenue that was getting eaten up in expenses is now free cash flow. And so it makes sense sometimes to pay up, because if you merge the correct firms, that cash flow is immediately unlocked. What we're talking about here is it's not an economies of scale situation. No. Right? This has nothing to do with economies of scale, which is typically the roll-up mentality. It's just purely packaging alpha. And I struggle to think of anything that like could be packaging alpha in our line of business.
Well, I'm going to take what you're going. Let me think about that, but I want to kind of take it in a slightly tangential direction of what you're saying. Maybe this gets too personal for both of us. But what it's me about our area of business is like for anybody to put a multiple on what we do as asset managers seems insane to me because our AUM fluctuates so much, and there's nothing to say you're going to hold on to that AUM. Like whereas I'm selling widgets or I have rental property, if I have a 5-10 year track record, you can get a pretty good idea what I'm going to bring in next month. Where you and I, it can vary dramatically. So when people start talking about multiples in our business, I just can't really wrap my head around it.
Well, so this is something I've given a lot of thought to, right? So I'll talk a little bit about my views. Like I think the multiple you apply largely depends upon what the revenue weighted asset allocation of the firm looks like. I'll go why that's important, and then how large the firm is. And that's more about growth rate, right? So let's talk about the first one, revenue weighted asset allocation. What is important here is looking at what is generating revenue for you as a firm and what asset exposure does that have. So let's say you are a small growing equity manager who is in the small cap value space, right? 100% of your revenue is coming from small cap value. There's a huge amount of variability there. Now, one might argue that just the natural volatility of that asset class comes with it a higher risk premium that your business is going to benefit from over the long run, right? So maybe someone needs to pay up for that higher risk premium, potentially. Versus a BlackRock, if you look at their revenue weighted assets, I mean, they look like a global 60-40. Like they can sort of, I would say weather any storm. Like they can almost weather any storm with a global 60-40. Like it doesn't really matter what happens. That's what they look like. And they're so large, the revenue stream is pretty constant. I don't know whether you pay a huge multiple for those assets. Like it's a sort of a steady profile. Maybe you pay more for stability and less for the idiosyncratic side. And then the size of the firm, right? I think what's important there is the growth opportunity versus the idiosyncratic risks. A really small asset manager has the potential to grow their assets dramatically, but it's more about the business versus a really large asset manager may have less potential to grow their assets quickly. And so the growth of the firm is more tied to the growth of that revenue weighted portfolio that they have. And so I think there are trade-offs here, but it's something I think a lot about as the owner of an asset management firm, thinking about the risk to my equity. I'm constantly thinking about what is my revenue weighted asset allocation as a firm look like.
Yeah, there's so many parts of that. One is like, as an owner, you can think about it. As a seller of, if you want to sell your asset management firm, there's one to think about it. But I always think about it as a buyer. And I just go, man, and this is the whole point of multiples, right? I can just haircut that multiple when I think of complexities and I think about the future. But if I look at any asset management firm and I'm like 6 to 12 months from now, how certain am I of this revenue? Whew, that's a tough call. But going back to your packaging alpha, it's not necessarily packaging alpha. I'll have to think about because I'm not sure how downstream or upstream, a lot of these firms are like, they have pretty much access to anything. So I'm not sure if we get any advantage by being a smaller player. But one of the ones, I have a family friend that they own an insurance company and they are just rolling up RIAs. And they are the ones that are increasing the multiple on RIAs because they're starting to buy at 10 to 12 multiples. Then it got up to 12 to 15 multiples because they don't really care about the RIA business. What they care about is selling their insurance products to all those clients. So they're just rolling up massive amounts of RIAs. So once again, you have a buyer that has a very different viewpoint from a strategic perspective. And so maybe that's the packaging alpha is like, they actually don't care about the AUM. They care about the number of clients and that those clients are checkbox high net worth and likely checkbox over the age of 55. And so there's maybe a packaging alpha play.
Yeah. I mean, look, let's say you were to take our peers. We got a bunch of peers and you were to take an umbrella company and buy all those peers, right? And these are smaller firms. Call it billion-dollar shops that all have their expertise. They have good years, they have bad years, they struggle to sell some years, they're raising assets like crazy other years. It's feast and famine when you're a small asset manager a lot of times. You bundle those all up and you kick the cash flow up, right? In many ways, it's like, it's the benefits of diversification. You should see an increased Sharpe ratio of that cash flow. Now, can you, even if you don't rebalance across them, right? The umbrella company just owns it. Okay, there's some drift risk there, and thinking about this as an asset allocation. But one might argue, right, again, if you expect them all to grow at a reasonable rate, that diversified cash flow might be worth more than the individual cash flow. And that's pure packaging.
No, that's a good way to look at it. Related to this, I'm going to bring it back almost like managed futures and everything. I'm trying to do a nice segue here. Is your homie Andrew Beer was on Top Traders Unplugged the other day, and I was listening to that.
Yeah. He's everywhere now.
Yeah, no,
I know
also,
I've said this in the past. Wait, I just really quick tangent. So I, full transparency, NewFound uses Andrew Beer's ETF in some of our ETF models. When I first started using it, I got endless questions about, is the ETF too small to use? The number of questions I get now about, has it reached its capacity within 1 year is insane. With the full 180 of investors going, it's too small, we can't touch it, to it's too big, we can't touch it within a year is crazy.
Well, it almost reminds me of what we get on the managed future side or commodity trend side. Is like they didn't want to be in it because they didn't have gains from commodity trend, and then all of a sudden now after these, they're like, did I miss out? And that like the gains have all been baked in, and now it's going to go down from here. So it's like damned if you do, damned don't. You drew a great like chart on that before. We'll have to find that and pull that up somehow. But yeah, I was thinking actually there's two things. I was like listening to Andrew on Top Traders. I was like, man, this is like a big advertisement for Corey. He's like, all he's talking about is like the growth of model portfolios, right? And he was saying the future is model portfolios, and that's why he built DBMF and the ETF structure is for people who design model portfolios. They could plug and play in their model portfolios, and they can hold it for 5, 10, 20 years. And he thinks that's the life cycle, that we're not going to have the same kind of 2010s issue. I mean, who knows if we will or if we don't. And I'm like, man, this is right up Corey's alley. Then in the end, he comes out and says, there's all these new brilliant asset managers and marketers like Corey Hofstein, Meb Faber, the Resolve guys. And he's like, this is the future of the industry. The whole buyers changed completely. And these guys that know how to use social media and go DTC, this is the future of the industry. And one, I was just offended that I wasn't included.
You weren't in there.
But two, this is my argument to you all the time. It's all about DTC. But like you always say, no, it's all about the financial advisors. Which is, it's kind of both. They're both. It's the same argument.
Well, so let's talk about this for a second, because when you talk about running an asset management firm, right? Who is your client? Are you going towards institutions, endowments, family offices, and pensions? That sales cycle is very different, and the products you have to manage and the gatekeepers are very different, right? You need to be very much in a narrow, specific type of product that consultants have a category for. You need to have your 3 to 5 year track record. You have to have your 100 million in assets. You have to be GIPS compliant if you run an SMA. And then you have to go get on the radar of all these consultants, convince them to do a review. By the way, you better hope that review is good. And then you start down the institutional path and you start filling out all these requests for product and trying to get allocations. It's not easy. And if you have not lived in that world, I think you need to find an expert who has lived in it, right? Who knows how to navigate it, because it's like any business, like you're going to need sales, and it's a people business. You need to know the right people. You need to know the gatekeepers to get that process started. You then have the business that I'm much more focused on, which is towards financial advisors who control a huge amount of the mass affluent net worth, right? They act and have discretion on behalf of many of the mass affluent dollars, and there's huge potential benefits of scale. If I sell to an advisor who has $100 million and he likes what I do and puts it as 10% of the portfolio, I get a $10 million allocation. When I think of the number of individual clients that represents, that might be 100 households, right? So I make one advisor sale to get through to 100 households. That's the potential scale I have going the advisor channel. And the other benefit is that I don't have to deal with a lot of PII, personal identifiable information, that the SEC is very sensitive about. The final one is you go direct to consumer, right? You deal with individuals who want to allocate with you. My personal bias, and I don't mean this in any insult to individuals who are interested in investing, is those people who find you tend to be some of the hardest people to work with from an ROI perspective. They have the deepest questions because they're interested in this stuff. And just frankly, spending all that time answering those questions to get one household versus answering all those same questions to work with an advisor and get 100 households, to me, the economies of scale are on pursuing the advisor channel. That's just the way I see it, because there's a huge amount of net worth out there of individuals who are never going to be interested in this stuff, who are never going to hear about this show and are never going to be our potential clients. That's just the way I see it. So I really struggle to see from a business perspective the potential benefits of going DTC. That said, the existence of your business proves me wrong and I'm an idiot. So there you go.
No, I mean we agree and disagree. It's like such minute deals on this. As you know, like you're absolutely right. The people that are likely, and shout out the booty crew and everything, the people that are likely to be philosophically aligned with us are people that are looking to do it themselves, right? They spend an enormous amount of time researching and doing the similar things we do. And so understandably, like they prefer to do things themselves. And that's why, we have various philosophical alignments in general. The only issue is, like you said, like I prefer, when you say, like, I'd rather the economies of scale and everything, to me as an entrepreneur, that tells me where a blue ocean is. If people don't want the hand-to-hand combat of dealing with individuals, I'm going to take on that responsibility because that's a blue ocean. And then also it diversifies my income base more. People go, well, I can be in multiple RIAs, but let's say you're only in 10 to 20 RIAs. If a few of them pull, they're pulling all those hundreds of households beneath them. And now you've got an AUM problem, and now you may need to fire some of your staff. And, we've talked about this, behind the scenes kind of ad nauseum. The one thing I will give you a shout out for, though, on it, it should have been patently obvious to me before, but made me think a lot more about, is my thesis has always been in the next 5 to 10 years, financial advisors are going to go the OCIO route. And I'm just building up my track record to show them, hey, here I am. When you're ready to come over, this is what we do. But to Adam and your credit, I really wonder, though, if the model portfolio and having the in-house, like he called it, the Navy SEAL team in New York City that's managing those model portfolios, all those financial advisors are going to go to that team and not necessarily come to somebody like us.
Yeah, it's tough to say. I mean, I think there will be the advisors who will tap into someone like you. But like, if you're a wirehouse advisor, you're always going to your home office, right? If you're a UBS advisor, You're not going to Jason, you are going to the UBS home office. You're an LPL advisor, you're probably going to the select home office models that have been approved from a regulatory perspective, right? There's a cover your ass aspect to all of this. You are absolutely right, though. You made a great point, which is the economies of scale cut both ways. If I lose an advisor, right, I lose 100 households, you might get much more diversification. I do think 40 Act products are particularly interesting. So 40 Act products, being mutual funds or ETFs here, are particularly interesting because I can focus my business and sales efforts trying to grow within the advisor channel, but individuals can buy my products if they want.
Yeah.
Like, they can go buy a mutual fund or an ETF and I can't stop them. It's just that I might not focus on growing my exposure in that channel. But if the people who find us and like what we do and read our research and discover the products on their own, great. What is hard, and I do feel bad about this all the time, is like, I can't show them our model portfolios because it constitutes an investment recommendation. And I can't make investment recommendations to anyone without understanding their personal situation. So very sophisticated individuals are completely prohibited from seeing what our models look like, because I just, from a regulatory perspective, can't do that. I also, if an individual, no matter how savvy they are, wants to talk to me about how we manage our strategies, I really can't talk to them about it. It's very difficult from a compliance and regulatory perspective. And that's a problem I've been trying to figure out how to solve for a long time now. A lot of my peers back in the early 2010s thought robo-advisors would solve the problem, right? You let the client fill out a questionnaire, it auto pushes them towards a particular model. The SEC came back in like the mid 2010s and just put the hammer down and said, no, if you don't really have someone reviewing whether that's an appropriate risk allocation, whether the client lied about their risk tolerance or risk capacity, you are making a recommendation that violates your fiduciary duty. And so a bunch of my peers who had spun up robo-advisors ultimately shut them down. And I don't know anyone who's really solved this problem other than just having to, basically take on the fiduciary liability, which is fine. We all need to have the fiduciary liability. Just for me to grow my business, I've said I gotta focus over here in the advisor channel, not the individual channel.
Man, I think we opened up a new way to kind of to get me to be able to put you in check or checkmate. This is gonna be a fun one. So we were talking about earlier, well, the Airbnb and the platform risk of Airbnb, right? Or like we always talk about, if you're on YouTube or Instagram, you build your business there, and then they deplatform you. There goes your entire business. You better figure out an email list or a Patreon or a Substack or something where you can have some control. This is a perfect example. You brought up the not having to address PII or KYC or AML. So by not dealing with that headache, now you're dealing with platforms with financial advisors, right?
Yes.
And now you're running platform risk, where with KYC, it cuts both ways. I actually know who my customers are. I control that data flow, and I know exactly how to reach my customers, when you have a lot of times no idea who's hitting that buy or sell button. And so
Right.
maybe that's the way you can put it
Yeah,
back. I'm just trying to find a new way.
No, you are 100% right. The scramble for us is always looking at who are our major allocators. And as much love as I want to show them, I want to go make them as small a piece of my allocation pie as possible, right? What I want is 100 advisors who represent 100 households, right? I need, or 100 households
Right.
each. I need as much diversification across advisors as possible. And to your point, as much diversification across platforms, right? So when you launch a fund, you're typically available at the major RIA custodians, Schwab, TD, Pershing, Fidelity, though not always, but you're not at the wirehouses. You can't be at Morgan, Merrill, Goldman, JP Morgan, UBS. You're not going to be available to LPL advisors, Raymond James. Good luck ever getting at Edward Jones. Not that maybe you would necessarily ever want to be there, right? But you are cut off from most of the world. You on the other hand, as long as someone meets the accreditation status they need to, doesn't like you can take anyone's money. I could have an advisor at Morgan Stanley who loves what I do. They'll just never be able to buy it. Yep. There's just, the gate is closed. And unless I want to pay a $350,000 check and go through all their hurdles, it's just, I will never see an allocation from that person. And so you were absolutely spot on. Like, it's trade-offs all the way down, right? You and I think we say the same thing every week. If the business were easy, everyone would do it. All of these are tough choices. But I think you have to be very aware of what choices you're making and make sure you design your business aware of those choices.
Got it. Your internet's starting to lag a little bit again, but hopefully it's back. So I'll talk while we're.
Listen, I've got a completely whitewashed background. I'm turning into a ghost for Halloween.
Exactly. So I actually wrote a few things down before we transition to some of those. One of the things I wrote down, though, because this started talking about Andrew Beer and managed futures or CTAs, I didn't quite have time. Wait, I shouldn't say time. I hate when people say I'm busy, I don't have time. It's priorities, right? It wasn't on my priority list today, but I did catch a few pieces of a thread today on Twitter about combining managed futures and hedge fund strategies. And shout out to Booty Crew specialist Michael Harris was on that thread too. I thought he said some great things. I didn't get to read the entire thread.
Great follow-up post for that as well.
Oh, really? So maybe you want to kind of recap it though, because like I said, I didn't pay close attention to it, but like I thought there were some really good pieces in there. And of course, Adam Butler jumped in as well. But like, if you want to kind of recap the kind of thread, and what was nice is seeing Michael, and I apologize to the other person that started the thread, but they were like, they actually had like a constructive argument that led to, a better outcome for all involved, which was, fascinating to see on Twitter from the first place.
So I believe the gentleman who originally started the thread or jumped in early, he's ex-Bridgewater, just launched a new ETF that is a multi-strategy ETF. And he's basically saying, look, these multi-strategy macro products are better than pure trend. Look, pure trend had a horrible 2010 era. It's got idiosyncratic risk. You're better in a diversified product. And Michael then tried to pull some data, and I apologize, Michael, if I'm getting this wrong. This is just from my recollection of reading the thread and reading your blog post. Tried to pull some data where he used the SocGen CTA index, and I think it was a hedge fund index, and he mixed them together and said, look, whether you're going for max Sharpe or trying to maximize your moarr ratio, like it's sort of, you would vary the blend. The original poster said, hey, it should be really 80% this global systematic macro, 20% CTA. Michael said, actually, no, it should be flipped. It should be 80% trend, 20% global macro. Adam then chimed in and said, well, let's be honest, like we're looking at point-to-point issues where like the hedge fund index is at a local minimum, the CTA index is at a local maximum. So if you had rewound a year and used realized returns, like you might be looking at different results. These Sharpe ratios for these products have standard errors. Like, don't be fooled by the precision of numbers. It's not 1.52, it's 1.52 plus or minus 0.2, right? Like, and so if you start to take all that into account, you know, Michael sort of brought it back and said, look, at the end of the day, you sort of end up at 50-50. When you start to take all this uncertainty into account, 50-50 looks pretty good. And unfortunately, like the frustration, I think, for anyone who's been in this industry long enough is like, yeah, just halvesies.
Halvesies.
Everything.
We're bringing back our halvesies.
Right? Do I allocate now or later? The halvesies. Do half now, do half later. Do I allocate to this product or that one? The halvesies. Like, it just halvesies is a really good policy.
Do I do buy and hold or trend? Halvesies. Like, and those two things were in my heart. Like seeing Michael start in too, like, no, you're apportioning it based on Sharpe ratio. If you do moarr ratio, you're flipping that allocation. So, you know, I was pumped to see him talking about moarr ratio for figuring out the allocation percentage. But then he came back in the end. He's like, yeah, but over the long term, probably halvesies. And then once again, I got excited again, because that's what we were saying. Like, when you've been in this industry long enough, or you see returns over multi-decades or multi-business cycles, it's usually like 1 over N or halvesies. And people go, well, we want to be more, you know, prudent about that. It's like, oh, what are you going to do? 52.7%? No, it's halvesies. Like, you want to be robust. You don't want to be, you know, perfectly imprecise. But that was an interesting thread today. And then, the other thing I wrote down, I got to way through, but on my first million, by the way, I always kind of use, as you know, I use the model of my first million podcast for like who we're going after, who we could be, like all that stuff. But man, they just blew us out of the water today. So they had Palmer Luckey on, that sold Oculus to Facebook and then is building Anduril now for like US government. And this was probably instantly in my top 10 entrepreneur like interview podcasts of all time. And I'm only halfway through it. I mean, it was so fascinating from so many levels. And if I don't want to spoil it too much, but for those who don't know, like Palmer's story, he was working like minimum wage jobs, like scrubbing boats and everything, fixing iPhones. The whole time he's building his Oculus VR strategy, like, you know, so, and he was living in like a 16-foot trailer. I mean, it's just the most unbelievable story. And then Facebook comes along and says, we'll give you $1 billion. And he goes, no, thanks. Not interested. I think the company's worth more. I'm like, who does the balls? And they're like, how about 2 billion? And he's like, nah, I'm good. And like, so like eventually they're like, you know, we're going to spend $1 billion a year of this for the next decade. He's like, okay, that makes more sense. Maybe we'll go with you guys. But like the ability to turn that down when you're working minimum wage, but even better, they started pressing him. And this is why the podcast is so good with Sam and Sean, is like, they started pressing him with questions like we'd want to ask or want to know. And I'm just shocked that people always talk about this publicly, like on their podcast. And not only did he turn down that $1 billion offer, but I thought you'd find this interesting. They had what he called the 100K club. I don't know if you've heard this, but at their business, nobody got paid more than 100K. So even him as a founder got paid 100. CEO got paid 100K. Like, and so he's sitting there making 100K, and they offered him $1 billion for the company, no. And he said no. And so everybody talked shit about they would turn it down, they do all these things, but like in that scenario, most people take that money and run. And it's shocking. But at the same time, the flip side of that is when Snap didn't take it, and then Facebook just stole all of their features. Yeah, that was a tough one. Well, although Snap's still worth much more than they offered them, though.
You bring up a really interesting discussion, and it's something I think a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with, which is what is the appropriate amount you should pay yourself?
Yeah.
Right. When you are an entrepreneur, you are looking at growing your business, and every dollar you pay yourself is a dollar not being reinvested in the business. And so I look at myself and I go, if I were not running NewFound, how much is fair compensation out in the industry? How much do I think I should make? If I pay myself that at NewFound, what growth opportunities am I potentially taking away from that hurt the long-term value of my equity? I've also made some horrible reinvestment decisions, right? And lit money on fire. I know entrepreneurs who were doing really well, reinvested everything, and then ultimately the business crashed and burned 7 years later and walked away with nothing, right?
I'm glad you're talking about that flip side. Yeah, that flip side's tough because like you've been building, it's primarily been in this industry, but you build many businesses, and I've built businesses across multiple industries. And so it's interesting. It's always easy to say put the money back into your business, but like you just said, what if you keep doing that and the business blows up? It's like you might want to be compensated for your time. You might want to be able to enjoy your life. So like you're saying, this is a conundrum without an answer. And this is why I've read probably over 500 business books, and all of them are absolute trash because nobody actually knows anything.
Well, and this is, I know a lot of co-founders and entrepreneurs who at some point or another cut their salary for the benefit of the business.
Yeah.
And the argument I've always made is if you cut your salary, you should make up for that in equity. And they go, well, the board will never go for it. The board will never go for it. I go, why? Like, and this is someone who I bootstrap my business. I've never had to deal with outside investors. It blows me away that outside investors would go, yeah, the CEO and the co-founders, they should bear this huge financial risk. Like, they should cut their salaries to make the business work. And that's just the risk they should bear without saying like, no, they should get paid X. They're getting X minus something. We are going to fill that minus something either with some debt that they get paid back at a later date, or issuing them some sort of equity as equivalent compensation. And everyone I've talked to, either they're just too afraid to have that conversation with their board, or they do, and the board pushes back on them and just says, no, we don't want to give you more equity because we don't want to be diluted. But to me, it's like, know what you're worth, and then figure out, like, it doesn't always have to be cash, but figure out the compensation that gets you to that level so that at the end of the day, you're not left just making sacrifices and not earning the appropriate compensation, because there's nothing guaranteed about any of our businesses. Like, could be out of business next year, and that's 15 years of my life down the drain.
Well, and I've seen tons of people, especially Amazon FBA or businesses require a ton of inventory. They justify their poor ability to run a business by saying, I'm investing back in the business. That's why I don't pull any money out or I don't make any money. And it's like, I'm not so certain. You might be not just running a well-run business, because that's why, and it's easy to justify that because that's what they see on YouTube from all these other business gurus, is just invest back in your business. Those who can take the pain the longest wins. And it's like, yeah, it's kind of like that, but it's not like that, right? There's a lot more nuance there, and it's more difficult. The other thing about the Palmer story I want to bring up that was fascinating is like, after he did sell to Facebook, they were asking like, what'd you spend your money on? What'd you do with your money? All this stuff. I think he basically said he put in like primarily like Vanguard 60/40 or whatever. He's like, look, I believe businesses are the best way to build wealth, which he's absolutely correct about that. And then he's like, I don't think I can outbeat the market, all that stuff, which is fine. And then he bought like his favorite car, bought his parents' house, those sorts of things. But he bought a marina in California. And you're like, wait, what? So apparently Palmer's into the whole like seasteading act, where you can build a new country offshore and everything. But what he figured out was the vast majority of marinas, especially in California, you don't own the water or the land that the docks are built on. You're on a long-term lease from the government. But apparently there's like 3 marinas in the state of California that actually have the riparian rights or whatever you call, like when they're built on the water land and the dock. So he bought one of those because he was like, eventually, if you're going to build a seasteading colony, you're going to need to get there by ferry. And if the dock that ferry's on is controlled by the government and you need to renew your lease, they're going to shut it down. But I was like, man, this guy is deep in the fine print.
Yeah. Well, that's the sort of, like, those are the edge cases, right? That you don't necessarily think about that ruin your long-term vision, right? I think that's a great example of knowing where the risks are and going, okay, like I haven't built this offshore island yet or community that I want to build, but like thinking through all the logical pieces and going, okay, where's the risk? Well, the risk is if the government doesn't like this, the U.S. government doesn't like this, they can shut down my access. How do I prevent them from shutting down my access? I block them out. Now, at the end of the day,
they'll figure it out.
If there's a battleship sitting outside the marina, I don't think it really matters. Like, at the end of the day, armaments sort of win all arguments.
That, or like you were before we got on, you were talking about your old condo in the south end of Boston. Is like, yeah, you might have owned something, but as soon as they want to do the big dig, guess what gets reappropriated? that land that your condo's on. The other piece to that too, before we before I move on to my next one, when you brought up, entrepreneurs or business owners cutting their salaries, they should be compensated with equity. I'm curious your take on this because it's come up recently with some of the other business owners I was talking to. Is a lot of business owners, it's interesting to me, they think like their business runs like a family and people should make sacrifices when the business is down. And I actually kind of view the opposite. Like all of those sacrifices and risks are borne by the business owner or entrepreneur, and employees take a salary or a paycheck because they don't want to worry about those risks, and they don't want to cut in when times are tough, and they don't want to work overtime. And it's not a family, because if you call it a family, you're willing to manipulate them to work overtime for free or to take pay cuts. I'm just curious of like how, if you, which side of the fence you're on with that.
I think it depends if there's sort of two things I would say. I think it depends if the employees are equity owners, right? I think if they're equity owners,
not. Yeah, that's different,
right? That's different. And then I think it's a question of if they're not equity owners, you know, how are they aligned as long-term stakeholders, right? If you say, hey, if they believe in the mission and they really want a business to exist, and you say, hey, look, we're going to be out of business in a year unless we all take a 10% haircut in our salary, and you know, I'll lead by example and take the biggest haircut because I own the most equity, and if you can afford to take some haircut, great. But right, I agree with you. Like, people typically take a salary because they don't want the risk. Like, that's the whole point of a salary. And so
bond-like income versus equity-like income.
Yeah, but I would also say if you're taking a salary at like a volatile startup, you have a mismatch here. Like
Yeah.
you're that's, to me, it's like, no, that's why you need the equity compensation, because this thing is, you could get fired at any time. You could run out of cash. So to me, salary at a startup makes a lot less sense. Like, if you're salary only, you do need some sort of equity compensation to appropriately, you know, diffuse some of the risk you're taking. But yeah, I don't know. I don't like, my view is if a company is running into cash flow issues, they're just going to fire their salary people. Like, asking people to take haircuts, I don't know if it makes sense to me. Asking them to take haircuts without compensating them in another way.
That's a good point. Yeah, you got to give them like future equity, almost like you were saying. If the business owner takes a pay cut, they need to look for equity compensation on the back end.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've had this conversation with my employees during lean years in the past, where I've said, look, I think you were underpaid relative to industry standards. I cannot afford to up your salary this year. How about equity? Right? I want your all-in comp to be appropriately valued. I can't give it to you in cash. You know, how does equity look? Are you interested in that? Like, I think those are very fair discussions to have. You got multiple levers as a business owner, you know?
Yeah, I've kind of laughed into myself. It's almost like you know, like when we sit around and everything, we always talk about in portfolio construction, like, what's your position size? And it's always like, I don't know. And then we're just talking about halvesies later, and we're talking about employee compensation. Everything we're talking about today is like, there's no right or wrong answer. Like, it's just like, no. I don't know. Like, you know, like you said, when you take money off the table.
Some employees don't want equity. They're just not there for that. They just want the cash. And so then it has to be a tough discussion of, you either can or cannot afford them. That's it.
Which is, yeah, I mean, which is my argument is mortgages were made for people that get, you know, bi-monthly paychecks. You know, it's not made for entrepreneurs, and that's why they want the paycheck, because they have a mortgage and they have other, you know, cash flows or income streams they have to worry about, and that's why the whole system's like kind of set up to that way. What's Taleb's quote? There's nothing more addictive than, you know, carbs, a paycheck, and heroin, or something like that. So that gives you an idea. So the other one I want to talk about in the business front, I was actually looking around for the book so I could hold it up, but it's not right around here. I just started the book. I've been meaning to get to it for a while, called The Match King by like Partnoy. That was about, in the 1920s, this guy built like this amazing like international conglomerate out of like Swedish matches. And I'm only like 10 pages in, but I wanted to bring it up for one specific reason. And that's, you know, like, have you ever heard about like Schopenhauer's philosophy of every generation you live is like selling tickets to the Conjurer show? So the idea is like selling tickets to the magic show. I think he was using like the old, like kind of county fair. Like, if there's a magic show under the tent, you're the one selling tickets, but you've seen the magic show. So the magic show is not interesting to you. And why he says every generation is like, for every 20, let's just call it 20 years for a generation, every generation you live, you've seen this cycle. So as we get older and older, we've seen this cycle more and more times. So I think like when I was younger, like the scathing pop princess was like Madonna, right? Then it became Britney Spears, and then it became Miley Cyrus. So it's almost like I've seen 3 generations of this. So like, there's nothing new when you're selling tickets to the Conjurer show, like, you know, those kinds of things. What was interesting, he was talking about right in the first few pages, in the 1920s, RCA, you know, what eventually became, you know, like the huge electronics conglomerate, it was making 60% annualized returns in the 1920s. It just held it. But what I want to bring up that's interesting about this, though, is I always, when you read about history, they always say, you know, pre World War II and especially pre World War One, all of the stock compensation was primarily in dividends, and everybody always had dividends, and that's how you figured out the value was based on dividends, and it was always dividends, and I always assume everything was drawn on dividends. Well, RCA did not pay a dividend at that time, and I bring that up because we've talked about this before. It's like, without the dividend, you couldn't value the business. It's like when, you know, when we talked about like on Silicon Valley, the TV show, when they're like, no, don't ever produce revenue because then people could create a value. And so what's interesting, we think that's a new phenomenon with startups in Silicon Valley, but RCA specifically didn't produce a dividend because it didn't have any cash flow in the 1920s. And therefore people were basing it on this basically like tech startup in the 1920s. And it was making 60% year over year returns. And I'm just saying, like, how we've seen these kind of cycles go over and over, you know, history doesn't rhyme or repeats, even though I hate that phrase. It's just fascinating that, like, once again, like what we thought was new with Silicon Valley, like don't show revenue. Basically, RCA was doing the same thing in the 1920s. And it's always great to read these historical references because then you learn about these things and you realize like nothing's new under the sun.
Nothing's new. Yeah, it's sort of this idea of like what's the way everyone is currently programmed to think about valuation and take away those context clues.
Exactly.
And I think the unfortunate reality is that doesn't mean people couldn't figure out another way to value you. It's just that when you break their tool, most people won't go through the effort of figuring out how to value you, right? Or it might just be,
right.
Dude, like, what is the appropriate value of Bitcoin? I don't know. That is a in my too hard pile. I'm sure some people have a very specific and potentially very good model for it, right? But if you're living on the dividend discount model and someone takes away the dividends, and you don't spend the time to think through how else something could be valued, yeah, I could absolutely see, right, that people just buying into the fervor of it being a new era thing. And so I guess the interesting question now is, what is the way people are thinking about valuation today? And if you're a huckster, you know, how do you avoid that? How do you break their mental context clues for appropriate valuation so you can raise at a ridiculous rate?
Do you have any ideas besides crypto? Because I was trying to, when you were saying that, I was trying to relate in my mind. I was listening to, I did a quick walk right before we got on, and David Senra of Founders Podcast, which is always one of my favorites. He was talking about like he thinks podcasting's so undervalued because we don't even understand it yet. Which is interesting because everybody's got a podcast. It's peak podcast, and he's saying we don't even understand it yet as far as like the context and the future value of spending that much time with somebody in your ear holes. And maybe that's part of it. There's no valuation metric for podcasting because it's relationship building and you can't necessarily put a value on relationships. That was just the first one that popped in my head. If you have any other ideas for what kind of breaks a DCF model, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, right? Because I think what breaks a DCF model, the conversation we had last week about brand asset value, right? Among influencers and individuals. How in the world do you value Ryan Reynolds and his ability to step in and buy a soccer team and generate a huge amount of international interest and new sponsors and revitalize the amount of marketing spend that the team can have and buy new play, like all of that, right? I think podcasting fits well within that influencer channel. I think what becomes interesting is like it's hard to figure out what the monetization multiple becomes of someone who has influence, right? Someone who is able to take their personal brand or a brand like Pirates, for example, and you suddenly apply it to rum or you apply it to, you know, sweaters or whatever. Like, how do you define the brand value when you can't even necessarily say what the potential monetization channels are in the future?
No, that's perfect because and like you said, and because of that, there's huge variance, and most of these influencers have no idea their value. And I just say that from personal experience. I don't want to kind of bring up my personal life, but as you know, like my girlfriend's an influencer, for lack of a better term, in the wine space, And I always help her sometimes with contracts. And even today we're going over another one. And it's just like, no, triple your price. They have no idea what they're getting, because like if you're trying to find, like, she's one of 3 people maybe. So it's like, how do you define that value? But otherwise you have all these other influencers that are used to it that will take like, you know, merchandise or $50 and they'll post about it. So it's like you have huge variance, almost same like you're saying with crypto. There's such huge variance.
Because I did that exact same thing last year with some sunglasses, right? I had never, no one has ever reached out to me about being, I was like, this will be kind of fun. They just wanted me to tweet twice for 2 pairs of sunglasses, you know? It's a weird world.
And you're like, I'll do it. I'll hoard myself out for some glasses. Absolutely. And not realizing you're worth much more than that. But by the way, you brought up the rum again. I just want to give a shout out to one of the Booty Crew, George, who I was talking to yesterday, who also happens to be one of my clients, but like he was saying he's first in line for the rum. So I think we're gonna start having a contest, or I'm sure like Sean's like, no, I deserve first in line. You know, Michael's, you know, we're gonna start like, how do we even who gets in line? I mean, maybe we could put our heads together to feel like who comes first serve, you know, first come first serve. Maybe that's not gonna work. I think, you know, how do we allocate to the Booty Crew, you know, in a democratic way or a meritocratic way?
Well, you know, pirates were all
assuming we ever make rum.
Pirates were all about the democratic way, so we got to figure it out.
Assuming we ever actually make rum, or you ever actually taste the rums that are just sitting in storage and
sitting there waiting for you to come join me.
All right, I had one more thing, but you know, we're at an hour. You seem like you're done. You're turning into a ghost.
That's what I was trying to do. It's Halloween, baby. It's spooky season.
You're just fading into that white couch with the white wall and the white sunshine coming in the background.
Yep, this is I hit all the high level must do's for podcast video.
Perfect. So once again, this is not investment advice. Please seek out your own financial advisors. Nothing we say is for investment purposes. Hopefully it entertained you. He's Corey Hoffstein. You can find him on Twitter at @CHoffstein. I'm Jason Buck. I'm at Twitter at Jason C. Buck. I got to remember my new handle, speaking of regulations and fiduciary responsibilities. Are we going to be back on Friday next week, or are we just going to now just leave it up in the air and we just pop on live, whatever? And maybe that's where we're going to break people's brain for podcasting.
Friday. I think we're back next Friday.
Do we need to? You just said you have to break your brain on valuations. Maybe, you know, the whole idea that you actually produce a podcast and put it out or a show on the same time, same day every week. Maybe we need to just vary.
For audience maximization, they say shitty audio, shitty video. Don't do it on a continuous basis. Don't have a schedule. These are like top tips in the podcasting world.
Constantly change your Twitter handle. You know, don't do it. Right. You know. But as always, shout out to the world famous Boo Crew. It's always great to have their comments in here. Checking us out while we're actually live, which you never know when that's going to be. So it's always shocking that anybody joins in. Other than that, we're out. Hopefully, we'll be Friday at what do we do? I can't remember. Was it 3 p.m. Eastern?
Yeah, 3 p.m.
Otherwise, you know, follow Corey on Twitter or Pirates of Finance on Twitter, and we'll at least put it out there with at least some sort of notice.